Hello and welcome to the Asian Religion series of Bright on Buddhism. In this series, we will be discussing religious traditions in Asia other than Buddhism. Buddhism never existed in a vacuum, and as it has spread all across East Asia, it has developed, localized, and syncretized with local traditions in fascinating and significant ways. As such, we cannot provide a complete picture of East Asian Buddhism without discussing those local traditions, such as they are and such as they were. Today, we will be discussing Shugendō, a very historically and culturally significant religious tradition in Japan. We hope you enjoy. Shugendō is the name of a highly syncretic religious group in Japan that dates back to the Nara period of Japanese history, which lasted from 710 to 794 CE. Shugendō is most commonly known for sharing rituals, practices, doctrines, deities, and characteristics between both Shinto and Buddhism, and for centering their worship and practice around mountains. As we will see, it's open for debate if we can really call Shugendō a religion. Some call it a cult, using the technical academic definition of the term rather than the modern colloquial one, which is far more specific and carries highly negative connotations. Academically, it's common to call Shugendō a mountain cult or to call specific Shugendō groups cults that center around the worship of a particular mountain deity or group of deities. In this, they are different from cults that fall under the modern colloquial definition like Scientology or Heaven's Gate. The name Shugendō is made up of three Japanese characters: Shu, meaning practice, study, or mastery; Gen, meaning to test or to trial; and Do, meaning way, with a capital W, which refers to a lifelong set of practices. Shu and Gen can also actually be read as one word, Shugen, which refers to ascetic trials and practices, making the whole thing translate roughly to the way of trial and practice. This title somewhat implies one of the most important and immediately obvious characteristics of Shugendō, which is that it emphasizes ascetic practices that take place in the mountains. Shugendō is known for being a quote-unquote mountain religion or mountain cult, but it also has a very interesting cosmology and pantheon, and some fascinating reasons behind the mountain practices. So let's get into it. First, I will briefly discuss the history of Shugendō, beginning with its development in the Nara period, and ending with its status in modern times. Then I will discuss some of the doctrines, cosmology, and practices that the group engages with. In so doing, I'll also discuss why it's called a syncretic religion, explaining how it synthesizes Buddhist and Shinto cosmologies, while also incorporating doctrine and ritual from both religions as well. Then I will conclude with a reflection on Shugendō's place in the larger framework of Japanese religion. In the 600s and 700s Common Era, the locus of political and religious power in Japan was emerging in the Nara region with the imperial court of the Yamato state. This was the state that commissioned the authorship and compilation of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, two of the earliest written histories of Japan. And this was the first state to settle its capital in the city of Heijō-kyo, present-day Nara City. This period was marked by attempts to centralize power under the imperial family and to legitimize their rule through governmental and social reform, but also through the manufacture of pro-imperial cosmological and metaphysical narratives. The theory that governments or ruling figures engage in large projects whose purpose is to bolster, legitimize, and cement their authority over the public is falling out of fashion with modern scholars, who critique it for being played out, for being a limited perspective, and for lacking nuance outside of the context in which it was formulated, which was Europeans looking at their own history. But I think that it still very much applies to this Yamato state. Across Japan, there were several disparate, disconnected, and varied folk religious traditions. In one region, there was a set of spirits or gods that were propitiated in certain ways for certain purposes, and then you travel to another region, and the whole picture and everything in it changes. The gods are different, the practices are different, and everything around it is different. However, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, which drew from many of these different traditions, sought to unify and homogenize these traditions as much as possible, while framing them in a way that touted the divine right of the emperor to rule. As part of doing this, these texts manufactured a divine ancestry for the imperial family, tying them directly to the realm of the gods, who were the progenitors of the land, the natural forces, and the people of Japan. This is one of the ways in which the emperor or empress was turned into the metaphorical father or mother of the people of Japan. The family was said to have literally descended from the creators of the world and all the people in it. These Nihon Shoki and Kojiki texts marked the first step in the construction of what we now call Shinto. During this time period, it is more appropriately called kami worship, a loose tradition of animistic ritual practices that have an aspect of propitiating deified natural forces, while also directly or indirectly giving veneration to the emperor or the imperial family. So, on the one hand, there were rituals that venerated the emperor, but also there were rituals that worshipped and propitiated storms, the harvest, famine, plague, mountains, rivers, trees, typhoons, rocks, etc. Mind you, the creation of these Shinto texts and narratives was all happening while Buddhism had been circulating and spreading in Japan for around 200 years. It had arrived from Korea in the 550s-ish and was taking on a great deal of authority and influence in the capital at Nara, where several large and important Buddhist temples had already been constructed and were already providing state-centric ritual services. However, though Buddhism had been circulating for such a long time and was beginning to be a very popular and fast-growing religious tradition in Japan, we should not think of its narrative for how the world is to be in conflict with the kami worship narrative. Buddhism had made space for that sort of folk religious engagement during its 500-year history in China, before it ever made it to Japan. And one could say that it had a lot of that space already built in when it arrived to China, given that there are several mythical creatures and gods that are adopted from Hinduism that figure importantly in the sutras. When Buddhism arrives in Japan, it arrives carrying about 1,000 years of textual discourse and debate and ritual development and evolution and doctrinal change and shift. Many say that Buddhism arrived already esotericized in many ways, speaking to how it was very advanced and fleshed out in a way that it had not been when it arrived to China in the 1st century CE. This context, both the Shinto and the Buddhist context, will prove crucial for the purported founder and developer of Shugendō, a mystic named En-no Gyoja, who lived from 634 to either 700 or 707 CE. Another name for him was En-no Ozuno, and although the narrative of his life has become clogged and suffused with fictional narratives, legends, and bunches of hagiography, there are some nuggets of truth and significance that we can pick out. He was said to be a member of the Kamo clan, who lived on the border between Osaka and Nara, a densely mountainous region, and gained a strong reputation for himself as an herbalist and a healer, leading him to even train high-ranking government officials. He barrels into the historical record of the Shoku Nihongi, which was compiled in 787. This record recounts an earlier tale of En-no Gyoja being kicked out of Nara in 699. He was banished to the Izu Peninsula, which would be a common exile or prison region for centuries to come, and the reason he was banished was because, quote, a person in court envied his power and accused him of trickery with his weird magic. The imperial court banished him far from the capital. Rumor says, Ozuno was able to manipulate demonic spirits, making them draw water and gather firewood. When they disobeyed, he bound them using sorcery, unquote. Right from the start, you can see that he has this air of being some kind of mountain wizard guy who is somewhat at odds with the government. However, we can't actually read too much into this banishment. Although he was sent away, his disciples were still awarded increasingly high rank over time in the government, indicating that while the government did not want his power and influence to be nearby, they didn't necessarily see him or his students as a threat to their power and influence. He was said to be very learned in herbology, medicine, and various kinds of sorceries, and he seemed to continue to have an okay life on the Izu Peninsula, training people up in his arts for at least another year or so, potentially more, until his death in 700 or 707. Though he is credited as the founder or developer of Shugendō, very little is known about what he actually did and what practices he actually encouraged. Most of what is said of him and his arts is applied backwards from later dates, indicating the possibility that he could have potentially been retroactively chosen as the patron of a religious group that was inventing or manufacturing its own history to establish itself as a legitimate group with a legitimate tradition and a long and storied history and lineage. This sort of invention of tradition is not uncommon, especially in religious groups who want to project a more authoritative and established image of themselves. However, it is equally possible that En-no Gyoja and his teachings were actually the roots of what we now call Shugendō. He was said to be the progenitor of the idea that enlightenment, magical power, and even potentially immortality could be achieved through trialing and testing oneself in the mountains, with ascetic practices, mountain climbing, and mudra and mantra practice. Another reason why the details of In-no-Gyoja's life may be a little unclear has to do with the fact that Shugendō is an initiatory, secretive, esoteric tradition. So, most of the secret knowledge that's implied by Shugendō practice and doctrine can only be shared from master to student. Whether or not In-no-Gyoja himself practiced or taught Shinto or Buddhism, Shugendō eventually took on a highly syncretic character, especially in the Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1185 CE. It began to incorporate deities from Tendai esoteric Buddhism, from Shinto, and even in some cases from Chinese and Indian folk religions. As part of their practice, Shugendō practitioners, called Yamabushi, Shugenja, Keiza, or Shugyosha, began to regard particular mountains across Japan as being sacred sites or domains where one could worship or encounter the deity that was associated with that mountain. One of the most popular and significant mountains in Shugendō is part of the Omine mountain range, which stretches from Kumano to Yoshino, and is called Mount Hakkyo. Kumano and Yoshino are both very important Shinto and Buddhist pilgrimage sites, and the whole mountain range has historically been very significant for practitioners of Shugendō. But Mount Hakkyo is the tallest of the mountain range at 1,915 meters, or 6,282 feet, making it one of the toughest and longest climbs in the whole range. According to legend, In-no-Gyoja himself climbed the mountain and buried 8 Buddhist scriptures there at the very peak, which is where it gets its name. So, it's a very popular pilgrimage site and place of ascetic practice. In the same Omine mountain range, but on a different mountain called Omine-san, or Mount Omine, there is the headquarters of Shugendō, or at least the highest and earliest temple that was allegedly founded by In-no-Gyoja, known as Omine-sanji. This temple is the site of pilgrimage and practice for many Yamabushi as well. Other important mountain sites in Japan include Hakusan in Ishikawa Prefecture, Mount Fuji, Mount Tate in Toyama Prefecture, and the Deiwa Sanzan in Yamagata Prefecture. The Deiwa Sanzan is actually 3 mountains near each other, Mount Haguro, Mount Gassan, and Mount Yudono, each with important shrines and sites all along the mountains. One significant reason that Shugendō was able to take on such a syncretic character was that by the Heian period, a narrative about the relationship between the kami and the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas was beginning to be propagated throughout the realm. This narrative was called Honji Suijaku, and the core thesis of the concept is that the kami are themselves temporary manifestations of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, making Buddhism and Shinto into mutually reconciliable religious traditions that could be practiced alongside each other in a tradition that was greater than the sum of its 2 parts. To see a concrete example of the implications of Honji Suijaku as they pertain to Shugendō, we only need to look at 2 mountains in Japan, Hiei-san and Koyasan. Hiei-san is the center of Tendai Buddhism, and Koyasan is the center of Shingon Buddhism. Both Shingon and Tendai are regarded as esoteric sects of Japanese Buddhism, and their mountains exemplify Honji Suijaku in that they are absolutely covered with temples and shrines to Buddhist and Shinto deities at the same time. There are hundreds of temples and shrines on each mountain, many of which enshrine Shinto kami right alongside Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Moreover, in a practical sense, both of these religious traditions entail ritual practices and cosmologies that include both kami and the Buddhas. These strongly influence the development of Shugendō doctrine and practice, which borrows heavily from mantra and mudra practice, kami worship, and Buddhist Shinto ritual. Thus, many sacred sites in Japan, whether they were sacred to Shinto, Buddhism, or both, became crucial sacred sites for Shugendō, like Mount Hakkyo, for example. Shugendō continued to flourish and be practiced around Japan through the medieval period, but not much is known about it because this time period was marked by almost constant wars being fought across the country, affecting the historical record to a significant degree. After that period, Shugendō re-entered the historical narrative in the Edo period, which lasted from 1600 to 1868. In the Edo period, with the resurgence in popularity of classical literature originating from the Heian period, many sites in Japan took on the status of being famous literary sites, or meisho. These were locations that had been mentioned or served as settings for very popular stories and poems in the classical Japanese literary canon. Yoshino is an example of a famous literary place due to the volume of literature and poetry that's about Yoshino or is set at Yoshino. During the Edo period, many with the resources to do so began to make tourism, recreation, and leisure trips to these literary places with the purpose of reciting some literature and returning home with souvenirs in a combination of tourism, pilgrimage, and religious ritual. It may sound complicated, but it's very similar to people in the modern day who visit New York City to go to visit the apartments from Friends or Seinfeld, or people who go to London to see 221B Baker Street, the site of Sherlock Holmes' apartment. It comes out of fandom, but it also is a personal journey that involves inserting yourself into the narrative that took place at that location, then taking that experience home with you, even if that narrative was fictional. This is a tourist activity, but it's no different from my Shikoku pilgrimage, where the purpose of the trip was to insert myself into the narrative of the pilgrimage, the narrative of realizing my own Buddhahood through practice and study, and the narratives of the lives of others I encountered on the trip, while also being a tourist trip at the same time. This practice bolstered Shugendō, as these pilgrimage/tourist trips for people from the cities brought many Shugendō sacred sites into the public eye and got them engaged with Shugendō practice. The Edo period was also a period in which Shinto and kami worship enjoyed increasing attention due to the resurgence of nativist studies and renewed interest in the classical literary canon, so Shugendō's Shinto aspects and practices were further bolstered and expanded upon. Shugendō was able to thus further synthesize and embed itself in the religious ecosystem of the time period, interacting with many other groups, commonly called confraternities, that engaged in special practice pertaining to a particular sacred space out in nature. For example, Fujiko, the confraternity centered on Mount Fuji as a sacred space, was developed in the Edo period, and it was actually founded by a Shugendō practitioner. There was a character named Kakugyo who lived from 1541 to 1636, who founded a religious group called Kakugyo Fujibutsu, which engaged in Shinto-style rituals offering propitiation to Mount Fuji to prevent it from erupting again, and to worship the Buddha/kami that they believed to reside there. These practices involved chanting, mandalas, self-purification, and actually climbing the mountain. So this was kind of like a subsect of Shugendō that focused in particular on Mount Fuji, and grew to coexist with larger Shugendō traditions as well. By the Meiji era, the government ordered a split between Shinto and Buddhism, arguing that they presented contradictory narratives about the origins of Japan and the Japanese people, and that Buddhism's narrative was blatantly false. So, in order to align Shinto with imperial and governmental narratives, the government attempted and somewhat failed to excise it from Buddhism entirely, ordering temple and shrine spaces to be entirely separated, prohibiting Buddhist monks from being Shinto priests and vice versa, and outlawing the practices of one religion on the sacred space of another. This required a standardized, intelligible, and applicable definition for what was Buddhism and what was Shinto, to be widely agreed upon. To create these definitions, an independent Shinto tradition that didn't have any involvement with Buddhism at all had to be invented and read back into ancient times, and this entailed rewriting Japanese religious history to a certain extent. Regardless, the attempt was made, and one of the side effects was that Shugendō, being so synthetic and syncretic as it is, was outlawed entirely. They didn't even just try to separate it out, because it would have been impossible. In 1872, the government just patently outlawed the practice of Shugendō, but most agree that Shugendō continued to be practiced in secret. This is a difficult thing to get a handle on because there is an aspect of thought control and an aspect of religious practice control, both of which are virtually impossible for a government to regulate. To outlaw Shugendō on the one hand means to outlaw the belief that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas reside at sacred spaces on specific mountains. People will continue to believe that even if they can't engage in institutional practice at the shrines that exist on those mountains. To outlaw it in a ritual sense is to outlaw the larger scale rituals that involve the public, which was successful, but it also meant outlawing self-purification rituals and ascetic practices, which are very difficult to distinguish from Shinto, which was not only not outlawed but encouraged. So there were myriad difficulties with regulating Shugendō during this time period. How do you outlaw Shinto-style self-purification rituals? How do you outlaw mountain climbing while chanting and making mudras? Those bans are incredibly hard to enforce, especially when Japan is ramping up to international conflicts like the Russo-Japanese War, the Asian-Pacific War, and more. Nevertheless, at the end of the war in 1945, religious freedom was restored, and Shugendō was allowed to be practiced publicly again. Since then, though it has changed a lot since the distant past, there are still many Shugendō practitioners. Building on the themes that we saw in the Edo period, Shugendō has become a bit of a tourist attraction, in the sense that foreigners will visit Shugendō sacred sites and climb the mountains for tourism reasons, but the experience that they're doing recreationally is a religious practice. It's like visiting a European church and praying during Mass just to experience Christianity, even if you're not a Christian. Still, there are many who do practice Shugendō in earnest, and the mudras and mandalas are still transmitted in secret. There are even Shugendō groups popping up internationally in other countries and regions of the world with mountains. There's a Shugendō group that climbs Mount Rainier in Washington. There's a Shugendō temple that is attached to a Renzai Zen temple called Korinji in Wisconsin. And there is a whole Shugendō International Association that has groups based in Denmark, China, Canada, and Switzerland. Now I would like to turn to the question of what Shugenja actually believe and what they do. The Shugendō pantheon includes esoteric Buddhist deities in the form of Fudo Myo-o and Dainichi Nyorai, also known as Akala Vidyaraja and Mahavirachana in Sanskrit. For more on each of them, please see our previous regular episodes about them, linked in the show notes. In addition, and from outside Buddhism, we also have Zao Gongen, a Shinto deity. Gongen is a title that means incarnation, and the idea is that it's a Shinto deity that's a temporary manifestation or a temporary incarnation of a Buddha or Bodhisattva, whose purpose is to make use of upaya, or skillful means, to lead people to the Dharma. There are many Gongen that manifest themselves at mountains all over Japan, and Shugendō practice would involve visiting their shrines on the mountains to make offerings, chant sutras, bury sutras, and practice mudras and mantras specific to those deities. Before going out, self-purification with water would be performed, and then while on the mountain, ascetic practices like fasting, chanting, and prostrations would be done. These all share characteristics with Buddhist and Shinto practices, and the idea behind doing all of this is that by doing it, you can borrow or manifest some of the power of the deity that you're making offerings to. It's fairly common to practice toward a oneness with Fudo Myo-o, for example, or toward a oneness with any of these other Gongen deities. And so the end goal is to achieve spiritual or even supernatural powers. Other rituals that they will engage in for the public include fortune-telling and divination, called bokusen, obtaining oracles through mediums, called fujutsu, obtaining oracles through mediums that have been possessed by a deity, called yorikito, fire ceremonies for averting misfortunes, called sokusai goma, and that is the same goma that is practiced in mainline esoteric Buddhism across Japan, spells and charms, called fuju or majinai, used for healing, childbirth protection, and so on, and exorcisms, called tsukimono otoshi, usually for the purpose of healing the sick. The performance of these rituals is always carried out by a master who has been transmitted or initiated with the esoteric secrets of the religion, and who has gone through the mountain practices that gives them the supernatural powers and ability necessary to accomplish these goals. Though these practices and beliefs can be observed in Shugendō in the present and throughout history, I think there is a simpler aspect to it as well, which is the idealization of nature to the level of the divine as part of appreciating natural beauty. There is this perspective that people have about Japan, and that many Japanese people have about themselves, that the Japanese people are more attuned and sensitive and appreciative to the beauty of nature. And one of the pieces of evidence toward that claim could be the invented tradition of Shinto, which sees kami in nature and thus deifies and worships it. Another piece of evidence could be Shugendō, which makes a religious tradition around being awestruck and enamored by the mountains. As an extension of that concept, it's easy to see how the practice of going out into nature could be idealized to the level of religious practice in a similar fashion to the transcendentalists of American literature. This is not to say that there are no religious characteristics of Shugendō at all, but it's to say that in the modern era, there is probably a very modern leisure and tourism aspect to it. Many of the mountains that Shugendō practitioners practice on are UNESCO sites. So it's almost like if we had a religious group that worshipped national parks or national monuments in the US. Half of their world would be the world of tourism and recreation, and then there would also be the religious aspect, however that would look. The main difference, of course, is that the Shugendō religious aspect is initiatory and secret, and so only deeply ingrained practitioners can engage with it on that deeper level. Now let's transition to Shugendō's place in the larger ecosystem of Japanese religion in the present day. In Japan today, there is a huge amount of religious diversity. Almost all global religious diversity is represented in Japan somehow. In addition, there are also many new religious movements and smaller religious splinter groups that operate in Japan as well, many of which we have talked about, like Tenrikyo, Om Shinrikyo, Soka Gakkai, Happy Science, the Unification Church, Scientology, Mormonism, and more. Though there is all of this religious diversity, religious engagement and belief is fairly low among the population. Belief is not central to religious identity in Japan due to the lack of the hegemonic influence of modern Protestant Christianity that the West is under. So, most people walking around do not express religiosity or religious feeling through self-avowed beliefs. Instead, their religious identity is centered more around infrequent community practice, such as religious festivals, annual visits to temples and shrines, and things like that. So, where does Shugendō fit in? Well, like many other organized and established religious traditions, engagement has been declining as the population becomes increasingly non-religious. Religiosity is on decline across the entire world, and larger organized religious traditions in Japan are no different. Then, speaking to smaller religious groups, many of those have achieved significant status in many cases, especially in the case of Soka Gakkai, for example. But after the sarin gas attacks by Om Shinrikyo in 1995, and after the Unification Church scandals surrounding former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's assassination, there has been this pervading suspicion of new religious movements in Japan among the majority of the population. So, where does that leave Shugendō? Shugendō is not a larger and more established religious tradition like Buddhism, Shinto, or an Abrahamic religion, and it's also not a new religious movement like Soka Gakkai. Overall, as religiosity declines, so too does engagement with Shugendō, of course, but at the same time, because of the tourism status that it enjoys, it can continue to survive. As Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and Shugendō sacred sites are increasingly declared to be UNESCO sites, and as they continue to gain revenue from tourism and international engagement, they continue to finance themselves and continue to exist. So, while the esoteric doctrines and rituals may be on the decline and may one day become a thing of the past, there is still engagement with the sacred sites and the mountains through this tourism, and there is still the fact that people have heard of Shugendō, which means that one way or the other, it is still operating in the world. Overall, Shugendō's story is interesting because historically, by being syncretic between Shinto and Buddhism, it has been subject to the ups and downs that each of those two traditions has gone through. And then in the modern era, being that it is not one of those two, it has found a different role and status for itself that's distinct from other religious traditions or movements in Japan. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion of Shugendō, a very important religious tradition in Japan. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.